Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Sessions. Really excited today to have a special guest with us. His name is Scott Harris. Scott and I met at Embark Behavioral Health. I had just finished up a presentation, I believe, that we were doing with some of our staff and talking about overcoming some of the stigma around mental health. And Scott was gracious enough. We had known each other really well, but gracious enough to stop me and come say hello. And then, so Scott, we'll talk a little bit more about that, but thank you so much for being on here. And I know we're going to talk a little bit about anxiety, but primarily talk about obsessive-compulsive disorder.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you are kind enough that part of the reason I wanted to do this, that oftentimes we get experts on who could share their expertise and talk about the facts and the statistics, which is really great. We can do some of that. But this is really about a personal mission for you because I know you said, Rob, that's something I've actually have some personal experience with.
You know, I heard your message and the company's mission to really break down that stigmatism that there is around mental health. And it occurred to me that other than some person that I had dated in the past, I'd really never talked to another adult about obsessive compulsive disorder. And I thought, I can't be the only adult that has this and deals with this. And so I thought it'd be interesting to talk about it publicly so that people get to hear that it's not something that they're dealing with alone. And I really hope there's some value for people in hearing this.
Well, huge value for us, Scott. So thank you so much for spending time with us. I know our listeners will extract a ton from this. And thank you for having the courage to share. And really, it's become part of your mission, I guess, in your purpose, even working for us, but wanting to help others.
Absolutely. I mean, in addition to working at Embark, I'm also a life coach. So personal development has been a big passion of mine and being the best and bringing the best I can, but also in becoming somebody who's compassionate and accepting of who I am and acknowledging that this is part of who I am and helping other people to do the same. You know, this is something I live with, it's something I deal with. And I can be okay about that. And sometimes even funny about it. It doesn't have to be a serious thing, even though sometimes it is.
I wonder if many people who don't really understand or struggle with OCD understand some of the loneliness that's associated with it.
Sure. I mean, it's something that generally for myself, and I'll just speak for myself, people don't see. You hide it from people. And so it is kind of a self-isolating behavior because you have an obsessive thought, you have a compulsive behavior that goes along with it. And then there's also the bit that people don't often think about, which is the embarrassment that you experience around that thing that you do. So, you know, an example of one of mine would be checking my credit card at the gas pump. Did I put my credit card back in my wallet and then in my pocket? And that's something that other people might see me doing. Or when I drive away from my house, did I close the garage? And, you know, if I have to drive back and check the garage door and my neighbor's still standing outside and I just wave goodbye to them and they're wondering, why is he back? And he didn't even get back out of his car because I'm checking the garage door. And so there is some embarrassment that goes along with it. And, you know, sometimes I can laugh about that. And other times it's like, you know, it feels a bit weird and cringy. And, you know, I wish they didn't have to see me doing that.
Yeah. I really appreciate that, Scott. Scott, if we could, we'll set terms, and then if you wouldn't mind, maybe we'll climb into and better understand your story.
Sure.
That'd be okay. So when we talk about, usually the term is OCD, stands for obsessive-compulsive disorder. Is there anything that comes to mind for you? Like what defines that? How do you know when somebody has this?
You know, it's interesting when I hear those words because, like, growing up and even into adulthood, I didn't consider myself to have a disorder, right? There was just this thing that I did. And so even hearing that and putting those terms around it is kind of helpful to me. So I break it down into, you know, the obsessive part. So there's some intrusive thoughts that occur in my OCD. And that's obsessive thinking. And for me, it's, okay, did I check this? Did I do this? Did I put my credit card in my wallet? Did I turn the faucet off? Did I leave the stove on? Did I close the garage door? And it doesn't matter that I know that I did. That's the obsessive part about it for me, is I know oftentimes that I did do that, and the obsessive thought is continuing. And then there's the compulsion, which is because I'm having this obsessive thought, there's some anxiety around it. Like if I don't check it, the faucet's going to flood the sink, and then the house is going to get water all over the place, or the stove is going to catch fire, or if I leave the garage door open, someone might steal something. And so there's a compulsion to actually act on that obsessive thought with an action. So checking the stove, checking the dial on the stove multiple times, checking the faucet, or checking the garage door is the compulsion to actually do something. And there's times when maybe I can stop a compulsion and maybe I have to act on it or feel I have to act on it. And I guess I've lived with the first two words without really acknowledging that it was actually a disorder or anything that I could do anything about for quite a long time before I realized that it was.
So for much of the time, you just felt like it was just an automatic.
Yeah.
Not recognizing, gosh, this is a disorder.
Yeah.
Something. Wow, so fascinating. Just really quickly, I love how you're defining it. Thank you. So obsessive thinking is really the thought process. Compulsion is this need to act on that. I would imagine what you're saying is one usually follows the other.
Yes. Absolutely.
You have the obsessive thoughts.
Yeah.
Then my anxiety is ramping up, and then I feel this compulsion.
Yeah.
To act on it.
Absolutely.
One thing I heard that was really fascinating is that, and you tell me this is true, that process, that cycle of obsession, the compulsion, once you act on it, there's relief, but no pleasure.
Yeah, that would be true. There's no pleasure for me in that behavior. There's a relief from the anxiety that I feel and a momentary relief from the obsessive thinking around it, but there is no pleasure in it.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think most people think like, well, you're getting some sort, like you're so driven by it, there must be some pleasure in that, like other addictions, but it's not that.
It's not moving towards a pleasure, it's moving away from an anxiety feeling is what it is. Yeah.
Boy, that's a really great way to phrase it. It's my anxiety is so intense that my obsessions and my compulsion, it's just a little relief from that. But then the cycle is still there.
It's still there. And sometimes even when you check something, that obsession will come right back. And even though you literally just checked something, you'll do it again. And that's the obsessive part of it. It doesn't make logical sense. Even to me, it doesn't make logical sense, but it's there. And in the absence of any other way of dealing with it, the easiest thing to do is to do the thing that you're compelled to do, which is to check the switch or check the faucet. And I found some workarounds with some of these things, ways of handling it. For example, with the garage door, there's some neat devices and apps on your phone that you can get that actually tell you whether your garage door is open or closed. I have an alarm system on my house, so I know every door and window is either open or closed. So those are things I don't really worry about so much anymore. If they made one of those for faucets and the stove as well, that would be wonderful. I'd be set.
Anxiety hack.
Right, exactly. Maybe somebody will, but...
Scott, if you wouldn't mind, take us back I'm just so curious. When did this start for you? I know the statistics say that onset is usually between the age of 10 to age 20. I was sort of taken aback, like, wow, age 10 is pretty young, but maybe does that resonate for you? Or
it does. I was a little younger than that. I would say 8 or 9 when I first recognized it. And interestingly, even at that age, I knew there was something kind of off about what I was doing. So I had this way of running when I was 8 or 9 where I would throw my leg back so that my foot would hit the back of my leg. And that impact was the compulsion. Like I needed to feel that in order to relieve the anxiety. And, even at that age, I knew this is not how everybody else runs. And I knew I felt controlled. Even at that age, I could feel the controlling of it. And because it was something so visible, I couldn't do it without being noticed. And so I eventually stopped doing it because my peers were obviously seeing it and making fun of me. And I thought, okay, I just need to stop doing this. And I found a way to stop doing it. But then the anxiety obviously didn't stop. And so it found other ways to come out as I continued to age.
Boy, it's such a great way to describe it, Scott, because I don't think most of us who don't struggle with this think about actually because of the social pressures, you were able to adjust the behavior, but it was sort of just putting a top on it, and it started to ooze out in other ways.
Yeah, absolutely.
Especially as you got older.
Yeah. Yeah, I found, my brain obviously found other things to obsess over and other concerns to be anxious about. So as I got older, one of them was my grandmother who lived next door and whether or not she made it safely to bed. So my obsession there was, is she okay? Is she in bed? Did she fall? And my compulsion would be to check. So before I went to bed, I needed to make sure that the light was off in her house so that I could then go to bed. And if it wasn't off, then I would have to go and actually check physically that she had gone to bed.
So could you literally, it was hard for you to rest or feel relief or just enough peace to be able to even go to bed yourself?
Yeah, I was very anxious if I looked out the window and I could see the light on. I couldn't see into her house because she was next door to us. So I could just see the light or no light. And that was my signal as to whether I could relax or not.
So even early on in your life, you recognize, I have some anxiety. I have some interesting ways to deal with anxiety. When did you first recognize, it might be this thing called obsessive-compulsive disorder?
I would say probably, well, first of all, I'd say I don't think I recognized I had anxiety until I was in my 40s.
Really interesting.
And I think because I had lived with it my entire life, I actually didn't recognize what it was. I was just so used to working at that level of anxious energy. And with the obsessive compulsive component of it, I was probably in my 30s when I started to recognize what that was. And that's actually, and I didn't, I wouldn't have said I had OCD, but did I do some things obsessively? Yeah. Now I'm, a few years on from that, I can say, yeah, I do have OCD. Absolutely. There are things that I do that are totally consistent with that.
And you're able to really attach that to underlying anxiety.
Absolutely. And I recognize when my anxiety level is higher because of something that's going on in my world, the OCD is ramped up as well.
So those two go hand in hand.
Definitely. Yeah.
So if you wouldn't mind, Scott, I know we use this term anxiety a lot in our society.
Mm-hmm.
What could you I always like to say, I always ask people, what's the difference between anxiety and depression? I always say, depression is about the past, anxiety is about the future. For you, could you describe, when you're saying using this term anxiety, could you describe what that is actually like for you?
Yeah, I'd say as a baseline, what I grew up with, it was always there kind of buzzing energy that I feel kind of around here and in my stomach. I think I was worried about a lot of things. And I come from a family of warriors, so that's not surprising to me. And because it was constantly there, I never identified it as anxiety. But it was I couldn't sit still without thinking about something that needed to be done, or what's coming next, what should I be doing about this, what's going to break, and so that's really how I experience anxiety, is when I sit still and I'm not still, and my brain is not still. And I've learned many practices to help myself with that, but I also know that because of who I am and how I grew up, I'm somebody that is going to have a level of anxiety most of the time. It's not at a level that is impossible to manage. I've experienced anxiety that is debilitating due to some life events, and that's very different. And I would describe that as plugging my fingers into a socket. That's literally how that felt when my anxiety was that high. But that's not my day to day. That's, it's a low buzz of, what do I need to do? What's going on?
The literature is very fascinating to me, is that there's a high degree or percentage of actual environment and hereditary components to anxiety. Did you find that? You said I came from a family of warriors.
Sure. Yeah, so my grandmother, who I was talking about, was a warrior for sure. And that was kind of the environment I grew up in. I was very close to her, and her whole commentary was about, not doing things. Oh, don't do that. Don't, try to avoid this. And it's certainly been in my parents' conversation as well, worrying about things. They grew up in the post-war era, and so there was a lot to worry about. And that's to a certain degree their mindset. And so I think I certainly have a component of that that's from the environment. And I'm sure from, previous experiences they've had and my grandparents have had too, they've had actual things to worry about that were real.
Yeah. But you even noticed that, wow, there's some components of this that we share in common.
Absolutely. Yeah. I don't know if anyone else in my family has any OCD. Not that I've observed, but we all grew up in the same environment.
Right.
Yeah.
But maybe not the same behaviors
Yeah.
to manage
Mhm.
the anxiety. Interesting. Oftentimes when we look at the OCD literature, that oftentimes it can manifest itself what we call co-occurring or dual diagnosis stuff, that oftentimes
Mhm.
there's anxiety will present as OCD, but sometimes there's substance abuse, there's mood disorders, there's
Mhm.
other things. Have you seen that in others, or how does that sit with you? Is that a surprise at all?
It's not a surprise to me. I mean, I'll be very open about my own experience.
Thank you.
Dealing with anxiety, and what I was aware of when I was in my teens and young adulthood was depression. And that was something that I dealt with on and off and didn't really have a way of dealing with. I wasn't, back then in England, we weren't seeing therapists, or at least I wasn't. And so there was no treatment or medication or anything like that. So I was pretty much left to deal with it on my own. And my way of dealing with it when I was a young adult into adulthood was through alcohol. It was the only way I found that could actually calm my nervous system down.
Mm.
And when I was feeling really depressed, it actually kind of numbed those feelings enough for me to be able to feel okay. And eventually the depression would, leave and I could get back to normal life. But for sure, that those two, go hand in hand, because when you're dealing with something that is, as a child, if you have no other resource and no other coping skills, it can be quite unbearable to be dealing with anxiety and depression, especially when, the depression is, persistent or severe. It's a really unpleasant experience to deal with on your own.
And mentioning the term alone, this
Hmm.
term lonely, I mean, as a therapist for so many years, there's a pervasive theme of whatever the diagnosis or whatever, there's this underlying feeling of the loneliness is the hardest part, the separateness, the feeling of being different, or that shame creeps in. And just hearing your story, it sounds like part of that, it gets real cyclical. It's a
Sure.
snowball effect,
It
right?
absolutely does. Yeah.
Yeah. It's got to be incredibly difficult.
Yeah, I think, when I look back at my youth and my teenage years, I really kind of pat myself on the back for having survived. um, you know, I had a lot of negative experiences growing up and was bullied in school for a long time. And that was something that, really with my depression, I think made probably have been the cause of a lot of it, truthfully.
Yeah.
I don't remember feeling depressed before that happened, but I certainly was afterwards. And it was very isolating because, I was being bullied at school for being gay. And it was at that time in the 80s, it was not something that I felt comfortable talking about with anybody, my parents included. And so it was something that I dealt with by myself, or not dealt with, because there was no way to deal with it, right?
Yeah.
And so I found, at that time, it was, for me, alcohol was a good way to deal with whatever I was feeling. And so that's what I did.
I can't tell you how much I appreciate your vulnerability and sharing, because I'm sure
Sure.
there's so many people out there that don't understand the multi-layered effect of this whole thing. I feel alone, and then I'm bullied, and then there's my sexual orientation and all of that stuff, multiple layers on this.
Yeah.
And yet you have the resiliency to persevere through.
It's, I'm really proud of that part of me that was at that age.
Yeah.
I can still remember it, and it was a tough experience, like going to a school every day. I had no means of getting out of that from the age of 11 to 18 and being bullied every day. And, I had no support network. I had no one to talk about it. I never talked about it, actually, because I was embarrassed about it. And so it was a really traumatic experience. We talk about trauma, and oftentimes I think people think of big, traumatic things that happen versus something that happens over time every day. I always relate it to like being in a prison cell. Like I couldn't get out of that experience no matter what I did. I was going to that school every day for 7 years until I graduated, whether I liked it or not.
But can I ask what gave you, how would you term it? Was it hope? I mean, I use the term resiliency, but what allowed you, because I would imagine so many teenagers were seeing that sense overwhelms them. And then they look at a horrible permanent solution through suicide or
Yeah,
whatever. What allowed Scott to persevere?
it's a good question. I'm stubborn. I'm really stubborn. And I was good at some things that I think helped me too. Like there were some things that I did enjoy at school, and I had a couple of good connections with some teachers that I like. I didn't tell them about any of this, but I liked them. I liked the subjects, and I had some view of a future. Like I remember what I had in my head was, I'm going to get out of here. I'm going to go to university. And when I get there, I'm going to make sure that this never happens again, is what was in my head the whole time. And, I did at one point consider suicide because I couldn't see a way out. And I remember that was when I was 16 and I was 2 years shy of graduating. But I was close enough to graduating that I knew I could get there. And so I think I didn't have some of the resources that are available today. I'm glad that there are resources available today and organizations like ours that help teenagers and adolescents struggling with the kind of emotions and things that I was dealing with and situations that I was dealing with, so that, there are ways for people to address and talk about some of the real life things that we deal with as kids. It's a impossible scenario for a child to try and deal with being different and, having to address being gay in an environment where it wasn't okay to be gay back then at all, and being bullied for it at the same time while not being able to talk about it. Like
While being anxious.
right, while
Wow.
being anxious
Yeah.
and depressed.
Oh my goodness.
So that was my life for 7 years.
So leaving high school, do you find the escape? Do you find a new world?
I
What
escaped,
happened?
but I escaped into something else. So,
Mm.
I escaped, and I had such a intent not to let that repeat itself. And by then I think that habit of using alcohol to numb my nervous system had already become an addiction. And so when I got to university, it was really easy to use that to, it's what we do. We go out, we drink, we party. It was Freshers Week, everybody's getting to know each other. And I was so insistent on, making the right friends because I didn't want to be bullied by anybody. So I got in with the crowd of people that did all the kinds of things that I would never have done as the little innocent kid I was when I was 7 or 8 years old. And, I found myself doing things that I wouldn't otherwise have done and, drinking and taking substances. And
Was there any worry within that? I so appreciate this conversation because here you have anxiety and here you have a tendency to, be anxious and want to make sure that, grandma's okay and all of this stuff. And
Mhm.
here you are involved with stuff that's kind of dangerous.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering what's happened internally for Scott.
Yeah, it was a bit, there was some turmoil. I remember the first time I ever smoked marijuana. It was like a huge deal for me because I was like breaking the rules so far from what I grew up with. I'd never done anything like that before. And I remember thinking to myself, like, this isn't what I do. Like, I didn't even like the taste of it, the smell of it, but that's what we were doing in the room at the time. So, all my friends were there, and then, with drinking, with drinking to excess, unfortunately, you end up doing things that are also, things that you don't want to do and are embarrassing. And then there's the anxiety that comes from that and dealing with that, the humiliation of, what did I do? What did I say? So it just, it builds. And, what do you do to deal with that anxiety? Well, what you've been doing all along to deal with that anxiety, you go out and you drink some more because that will take away the anxiety. Yeah.
So the cycle really builds on itself.
It really does, and you use that so much as a coping mechanism that you perhaps miss out on some of the other coping mechanisms that you could build when you're at university, through social skills and actually developing relationships with people that can be a support for you versus, you kind of as an alcoholic, you're more, hiding away, trying to cope with everything on your own. And actually, every time you feel bad, you're going to want to use your crutch, which is alcohol.
Yeah. It's a way to
Um,
cope. Way to cope.
It's a way to cope, yeah. And it was a way I used for a very long time. And I didn't know what I was dealing with. And there was a lot of judgment and kind of shaming from myself over the things that would, you know, the things I would feel like when I was really depressed. Like, I didn't know what that was. We didn't have a school therapist back then. We weren't taught about it. So, I just knew that I would have these episodes where I'd be like so sad that I couldn't be around people and I would walk away from people and shut myself away and people would notice. And I didn't, I just felt so strange that, I was behaving that way. My drinking kind of, some people noticed, but most people just thought I was the party animal of school. And I managed to scrape through with good enough grades that I did okay. But, it was just a crutch. Yeah.
One thing that I'd love for you to talk about is that oftentimes people want to appeal to your rational thinking. Like it's an insight issue. Like you're just not putting two and two together, Scott, or like people have this. What I think is interesting, especially knowing you a little bit, such a bright, just insightful human being. That's not new, right?
Right.
Like I would imagine you had the insight the whole time, but how do those two to go together? The insight and yet, there's physiological, emotional
Sure.
responses.
I mean, I would say if I broke them up into two things, so there's the OCD part and the alcohol part, right? So with the OCD, I used what I know and what I could teach myself about it, and so I tried things like exposing myself to the stimulus over time. I used to travel a lot for work, and so when I was in a hotel room, I didn't care so much because it wasn't my house. So I trained myself to not care about when I was in a hotel room, which gave me some safety. And it kind of lessened the anxiety around the faucet and the door and. And then I would also think to myself, well, if the house does burn down, I've got insurance. It's not the end of the world. So that worked for a while as a logical, kind of defense mechanism. But then I got a dog and it wasn't that didn't work anymore because I'm like, well, my dog's in the house. That's not, I can't logic my way out of that one, right? And with the, with the addiction side of things, I've had people say before, well, you can just stop drinking, or, if you actually try hard enough, or it's just a willpower thing. It actually isn't. Alcoholism is an addiction. And so when you really understand addiction and where addiction comes from, it comes from, having behaviors, having anxiety underneath all of that and depression underneath all of that from, whatever reason, whether we grow up in an environment that is abusive, or whether we grow up in an environment that's anxiety invoking, or whether we're bullied at school, whatever it is, we end up with anxiety, depression, and a set of feelings that are really uncomfortable. And you're going to want to find a way to address those. So for me, logically, and I've tried many logical ways of trying to address alcoholism before I eventually found the final way. I tried changing what I drank, drinking on different days, only buying this amount of alcohol because that wouldn't get me, that drunk. I would only drink on weekends and not on weekdays, or never on a Sunday because that was before a work day and I didn't want to be hungover. Every
So it sounds like you came up with strategies.
Absolutely.
But not a way to really address the core.
No, because it wasn't drinking that was really the underlying problem. The underlying problem was how I felt about myself, and the intensity of the feelings. And some of it wasn't just anxiety, depression. It was, sometimes it was numb. From the bullying at school, the degree of trauma that I experienced, sometimes I would just be completely numb and experience these states of, dissociation, where I felt so dysregulated and I was unable to make a decision. So I would sit on the couch and just sit there, and I didn't know whether I was going to go out, not go out, and I couldn't decide, and it was really uncomfortable. And so that was something else that I would drink over, because I couldn't stand that feeling of just that numbness and not being able to make a decision about whether something as simple as whether I was going to go out.
So here's this bullying effect of feeling just ostracized and rejected. And I mean, it must have been so horrible, Scott. And are there relationships in your life that you rely on as a secure base? Is there people in your life that help to balance that out?
Absolutely, yeah. I have a really solid network of friends in my life today, some of whom experience the same things, and so we can relate, and that's really helpful, because when you can talk openly about these things, if you do feel anxious about something, or depression comes back, knowing that you can talk to somebody who knows what you're talking about is really helpful. And I have found a therapist that I work with, that I like to explore different strategies and coping mechanisms for things and changing behaviors. I'm always looking at, which behavior works better in which situation. So, those are things I look at, but definitely a friendship network has been really important.
Did relationship play a part in your healing journey?
I would say yes, definitely. Not as in a romantic relationship, but although one of them did. So the one person I dated who actually did have OCD was the first adult that I experienced that I actually spoke about it, because we couldn't really avoid talking about it because we both noticed each other's behavior.
I wonder how that is, being in a relationship with two OCD.
It was, what we ended up, we kind of joked about it. It was funny to us because he would check one thing and I would check another thing, and we would kind of laugh at each other and be like, all right, you check that, I'll check this, and then we'd leave. And so when we could look at it in that light, it wasn't a thing to be embarrassed about. It was just, something to laugh about. I think that really helped a lot. But the friendships that I've developed and the community that I've developed of people that have an understanding of both mental health disorders, anxiety, depression, and addiction have been tremendously helpful, because what really doesn't work is to sit back and judge yourself or anyone else for what they're struggling with. what works is to talk to somebody who actually understands what you're talking about and maybe has gone through it as well. I mean, therapists are great. As I said, I work with one, but working and talking with somebody who actually has experienced what you've experienced or are experiencing is, it really helps you to know that you're not alone. And, plenty of people have experienced this and do, and there are ways to deal with it.
So I'm hearing what you say, Scott, is that it actually takes a multifaceted, approach.
Yeah.
Therapist, great resource. Professionals,
Yeah.
great, but also a community of people who are in this or healing themselves.
It definitely does. And I think one of the dangerous things about anxiety and depression is it does naturally lend itself to isolating and being on your own. And that's definitely one of my go-to behaviors. I'm very happy in my own company most of the time, but it can be to my detriment. And so I almost have to push myself to go out. And I think that's something that's really helped me tremendously. And if one of those things worked on their own, it would be wonderful. For me, it didn't. I trained as a life coach, and I've been doing personal development work since 2008. And I know about changing behaviors and mindset, and it's a very useful tool in many aspects of life. It did not address my depression, and it did not resolve my alcoholism. So I knew that did not work on its own. And so I continued to search, and I found, another program that did work for my alcoholism. And then I found other practices that worked for my depression. And I also found that when I stopped drinking, my depression wasn't as severe and chronic as it had been.
So when they talk about alcohol being a depressant,
yeah,
that's true.
It's absolutely true.
It numbs you.
Yeah.
There's relief in the moment, but boy, that exacerbated a lot of that depression.
Absolutely, yeah.
So what I really value, Scott, as you're saying, is that I use the term healing journey, because even the time that we've gotten to talk and you stopped by my office, you talk about getting better and healing, but you're managing it. It's not this miracle, boom, my anxiety's gone, my OCD is completely better. It's not that.
It's not. And, from the day I stopped drinking, alcohol, my life started to improve in many ways, physically, psychologically. But I was also doing other things that helped build things like self-esteem, built friendship networks. I became very involved in the LGBT community and leading retreats and doing a lot of personal growth work. And those things really helped me to learn other skills and get involved in things that lifted my spirits naturally. They were things that I loved to do, and I met people that I liked to be around. And so that was another part of my healing journey, was just allowing myself to experience things and get out and meet people. And I think for myself, I feel like I'm probably going to be on this journey until I'm not. I think anxiety to a certain degree is going to be with me most of my life, but it's in a manageable way. And I think with the OCD, it's something I continue to. It interests me because it's a facet of me that I haven't really fully gotten my hands around ways that I can minimize it. I've tried some things, and I've dabbled a little bit, and I'm curious to see how far I can take that, and what else I can do to allow it to be there, accept it, but also keep it to a minimum.
I'm smiling, Scott, because you said we mentioned this healing journey, and I'm smiling because I'm like, that journey has molded you into this incredible person that you are today. We wouldn't be sitting here having this talk. I wouldn't feel so fortunate to be able to share this with you, and you being able to share it to a whole nother community without that journey.
Yeah, it's an incredible thing, this gift we have called life. There are many times in my life when I would not have called it a gift, and I wouldn't relive my childhood for anything in the world, but I also wouldn't give up the experience I have, because the amount of conversations I've had with people, the people I've coached, the people I've worked with, and helped. I find that that's such a blessing to be able to share, what I've struggled with to help another human being overcome what they're struggling with, or even sit with it if they can't overcome it right now, just be there.
I really love how your journey of healing is really integrated this whole service component and giving and caring and compassion to others. And that's part of it.
It definitely is. I think, from the day I started becoming a coach and a life coach, I've always had a desire to help people become free in whatever aspect of their life they choose to. And I think working with Embark, it's kind of brought that to another level, or focused it a little bit more now on young adults and adolescents, and not necessarily an age group I would have said I related to that much before, because I don't have kids, but I do relate to that young part of myself. And I can, the minute I started talking to kids and parents here, I immediately, could relate to them immediately, because I'm like, that's exactly how I felt. I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, it's amazing how many adolescents and teenagers and even young adults just struggle with this feeling of ostracized and bullied, and just the profound shame and rejection that comes. It feels hopeless.
It does.
And yet you were able to find some hope in your own journey.
It does. And, I'm grateful that I grew up when I did. For some reasons, there wasn't social media back then. So, there wasn't cyberbullying and some of the horrific things kids deal with today because of that. And I also am grateful that I've been able to take what I experienced and turn it into something that's useful and feels good to me too. I feel like I'm not in a place where I look back at my childhood and am terrified by it, or I'm traumatized by it anymore. Like I said, I certainly don't want to go back there, but I can definitely use it to help other people.
Well, Scott, we're all reaping rewards from your journey and you being able to do that. Just in closing, what are you looking forward to in your life?
I'm looking forward to, and this is a bit of a vague answer, but I'm looking forward to what's next. I'm very used to keeping myself very busy, and I think that comes from being an anxious person. I'm used to leading retreats and teaching and coaching, and for the first time in my life, I just moved to Arizona. I haven't planned a thing. So I'm actually looking forward to some downtime and seeing what comes from that. What new interests might I find, or people I connect with. Maybe it's more nature, but not busying myself with things.
Great.
Yeah.
Awesome. So maybe one quick takeaway from what is it you want everybody to know? Something that you're like, and if you're leaving here, what is it you want?
Maybe you heard something in what I shared today that speaks to you, whether it's OCD, anxiety, depression, alcoholism, any of those things that we carry shame and embarrassment about. These are things that so many millions of people deal with very quietly, often by themselves, and you really don't have to. There are ways to talk about this. There are people to talk with about these things that can actually help. And I'm one of them, and you're one of them. And you really don't have to suffer alone in this.
And Scott's a living example of that.
Thank you.
Just so appreciate it. One thing for me, big takeaway, is that it might be OCD that's the symptom. We might be checking and counting and doing all of these other things and have obsessions and compulsive thinking, but it's anxiety and depression underneath that. And this multi-layered effect of trauma and all of these other things are really adding up, and yet there's hope to be able to resolve all that.
Yeah.
Scott, invaluable time being with you today. I just so appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Yeah. So everybody, thank you for joining Sessions. Thank you to Scott. Please access us wherever you access podcasts. See you next time.